Hello, everyone. I'm Robbie Swale, and this is the 12-Minute Method podcast. And in this podcast, I'm going to be investigating how we can beat procrastination, be more productive, and finally do those things we have been meaning to do. And in season 1, what that means is I'm going to be reflecting on a number of things that I mostly first wrote about together in one place in the About the Author section of the 12-Minute Method books, in book 1 in particular. These are things that over my life I have procrastinated on, thought I might not get done, and then finally done in the end. And in each episode, I'll spend up to 12 minutes reflecting on one of those things and sharing those reflections with you, hoping to identify patterns, things that you can use, ways that you can finally do the things that you've been meaning to do. Hello, everyone. This is episode number 11, and today I'm finally going to talk about the books, the 12-minute books, and maybe the Power to Choose a bit will come into it as well, which is the unreleased book that I haven't finished, which therefore doesn't deserve an episode of its own in this series, because this is a series about things that I actually have done. I've procrastinated on it, and then I've done. First of all, though, before I get to the books and the publishing story of those, I want to talk a little bit about reflections on the last episode. And I think because it wasn't one that I had planned, it's not one that I've thought about massively. Quite a few reflections I had as I was listening back to that episode. So the first thing was, I referenced in there how the 80-20 rule has been important to me for emails. And in this series, I'm going to be talking mostly about the big things. I'm going to be talking about books, podcasts, relationships. I've already talked about some of these. Still to come, I'm going to talk about this show. I'm going to talk about my podcast challenge, these kind of things. But all these ideas have worked for me for the little things as well. And if we want to be more productive and beat procrastination and do the things we want to do, we also have to tackle the little things. So a couple of those that are just worth mentioning. The emails is a good one. So what's the 80-20, just in case you haven't listened to the last episode or missed it, what's the 80-20 analysis on writing an email? Well, in the first draft, you've done way more than if you just sent the first draft without proofreading, you will get way more than 80% of the impact as if you spend, you do another 100 proofreads, because mostly your email writing is absolutely fine and everyone forgives typos. I try to do draft the email, and then send it, unless it's a really important one, in which case I'll proof it once. But I had a difficult email to write yesterday and I spent half an hour on it. But I know that's too long, right? That's a lot of time to spend on writing one email. It's probably too long. This one was a sensitive one, so I did want to spend some time on it. Another good example is in my coaching business, I used to send typed up notes from what I'd scribbled in a session to all my clients. And I just realized at some point, this is, well, two things. One is 80-20 analysis of coaching. Way more than 80% of the impact comes from the coaching session. Spending another 15 minutes writing up notes from an hour-long session does not give me another 25% of impact. It gives me like 5%. And some people don't even read the notes. And the other thing is, when we're thinking about productivity, is to think about that. And again, I referenced it last time. I think I've mentioned it before. The zone of excellence, zone of genius, zone of competence kind of map that Gay Hendricks I read about first in his book, but other people have talked about this as well. And that's the idea that the places which will create the most abundance and satisfaction for you, the most impact, are going to be the sweet spot of your strengths and what you love. And that wasn't writing notes for me. Like, I know I've done the investigation. I'll put a link to the Zone of Genius questions, which I wrote an article about once in the show notes, so you can check them out. But if you know what your zone of genius is, then you can start focusing your time on doing that, and probably that will lead to greater productivity. So this is pretty much zone of genius activity for me. It's a little bit, I sometimes wonder, because I don't always get huge amounts of energy from recording a solo podcast. But speaking in this way as freely as I can is absolutely, I know, is me at my most productive. Whereas, typing up some notes from this, writing the sixth draft of an email definitely isn't. So those are some frames that are worth thinking about, that last episode sparked for me. And remember that a big part of doing the big things is stopping doing the little things. So that's that Warren Buffett story that I've talked about in the last couple of episodes. It's saying yes to one thing is saying no to something else. And that's in the time management article. I'll link to that as well. Because I learned that from my friend Sarah Cartwright, and it's just been so useful for me. And the little things count as well as the big things. So that's that first kind of bigger point. Then a few other reflections on episode 10 about reading. It started, that reading habit, from being ill. And in Keep Going, the Keep Going book, the second 12-minute book, How to Keep Going When You Want to Give Up, there's a section which is about lessons for the dark days. And if we're going to keep a habit going over a long period, there will be times when things are going badly. And it's really important that in those times, if we want to keep going, and we've got to be careful with this because we don't want to push ourselves too much. But reading, for example, is a nourishing habit for me. I know that that's good. It feels like when I'm tired and ill, I shouldn't do it. But the reality is I should double down on it then. It's like the Dalai, that Zen saying, it's sometimes credited to the Dalai Lama. I think it's older than that. I meditate for an hour a day, except when I'm busy, then I meditate for 2 hours a day. Now, I don't meditate for an hour a day, but that is another little, I'm going to write that down. Because we might come back to that in the final episode, because it is another interesting story, meditation for me. Maybe we'll do a meditation episode, actually. Maybe that'll be episode 12. So build the habits. If you're going to build a habit for the long term, build it in the knowledge that there will be times when things are difficult. Reflect in advance. What will I do in those times? Is this a habit that I want to keep going through the times when I'm really sick, or the times when someone I know is very, very sick, or the times, when other difficult things are happening, or my mental health is poor? What do I do in those times? And for me, making things sustainable for them is really important, because it's times like that. I often think about it with exercise. It's when you get injured, you've got to be really careful. Are you going to pick that exercise habit back up after you're fit again? And the same is true with, if you're mentally struggling, emotionally struggling, that's the time when it make real sense to stop. And then the question is, are you going to keep going, pick it up again? And for me, a better option has always been, I think, to keep going very slowly as necessary, but keep going a tiny bit, even in the dark times. The enough lesson from that episode is really important. The Bannister method: obsess about doing just enough reading to keep going. A cool thing I realized, I don't think I mentioned in the last episode, is a cool thing about the reading habit is it's tied to something I do every day: drink a morning coffee. I heard Dr. Rangan Chatterjee, who has a great podcast, talk about this as well. He ties his exercise, so he's a medical doctor, so he's interested in exercise as well, but he ties his exercise to his morning coffee. So in the 5 minutes his coffee's brewing, he does, I can't remember what it is, some push-ups or some star jumps or some lifts or something, and that's enough exercise for him. And he ties it to his coffee because he's never going to forget to drink his coffee. So, I remember hearing somebody say they tied their gratitude practice to lunch because they never forget to have lunch, but they always forget to do gratitude. There's all those kind of things as well. So tie something you want to do to something else that you're going to do. It's also worth saying I had to detach myself from other habits I liked. So I liked drinking my morning coffee while doing a coaching session, because there's a rush from drinking the coffee, and it's fun to have that with the first coaching session of the day and with other things. So that was a little hard at first. That was one of the bits of resistance, but I think I knew that the reading was important, and so I decided to detach it from those other things, or to experiment, right? That's the other thing to do. Run one of these things as an experiment for the next month. It's really interesting to reflect that reading slowly could be better than reading fast. I think that could be really true, especially with non-fiction. A bit less with fiction. Mostly I'm reading fiction as an escape, like I said. But for non-fiction, how I often learn from reading non-fiction is by sharing the ideas with clients and seeing where they land, and by applying them in my own life. And so with the example of the chapter in The Meaning Revolution that I wrote, the 12-minute article, It's Time for You to Die, about, which is the most read 12-minute article, chapter 1 of How to Create the Conditions for Great Work. That chapter is called Die Before You Die in The Meaning Revolution. And I would have been reading that chapter over a period of weeks, because I was reading it 10, 15 minutes at a time when I was stressed, reading paragraphs over and over again. So I just had far more chances to apply that to my life and to share it with clients while it was kind of being presenced into my mind every day through that reading. So, and I think that for reading habit is actually a really nice idea. And there have been a few of these. Like, I've changed my exercise habit since the exercise episode, because I saw some things in that. I was like, I'm just getting in my own way. I can just do an imperfect but better than nothing weightlifting session once a week. And the same with this. I think there's an insight here for me, which is going to be, I'm going to keep this reading slow habit, because I think it's better than reading fast sometimes. Then there's a really nice thing that I realized about it just listening to the end of that episode, which is it's not an everyday habit. One of my clients recently was talking about the distinction for her between a habit and a routine, and how routine felt too trapping. But habit, which might be, doing one 12-minute article a week, but I don't know which day it is, or I'm going to read every day I'm working at home with my morning coffee, but not the times that I'm going out because I'm going to be walking with my coffee or getting it at work or whatever it is. That's habit, and routine is I have to do it on Wednesday mornings. And in a way, habits are in some ways more effective, but they're also more brittle. If you can keep to them, they're more effective. They're the hair, right? But they're more brittle. If you break them, if you miss Wednesday, then you've broken it. You got it wrong. No point carrying on. Might as well give up. So it's interesting that build a habit that isn't daily. That's okay, and then hold it lightly enough that if I don't read with my morning coffee for a few days because I'm away for work, then that's okay. But tightly enough so that next time I'm at home, I do read with the morning coffee. And I think that's a difficult thing to do in theory, but in practice for me with reading felt relatively easy because I pretty soon, some of those things we've connected to before, there's a bigger why about learning, about reading. And as pretty soon I discovered it was a nourishing thing for me. So I felt the impact of that habit and I kept it going. So that is reflections on episode 10 about reading nonfiction. Let's start the timer. And today, in this episode, the focus is going to be the publication of the 12-minute method books. So quick rewind. Now do go back and check out, I think it's episode 4, which is about starting a blog, the origin of the 12-minute method. But to do a really quick version of that, to kind of get us up to 2019, I started a blog because I was anxious about sharing the theme my coach and I, Joel, and I gave it was sharing myself with the world. And we created a practice, which was get on the train, write while the train is moving, stop when it stops, proofread that article once and post it on LinkedIn. That didn't necessarily, the way I've been telling that story, it didn't necessarily feel fun or nice, but it felt good, felt worthwhile, felt right. So I decided to keep it going. I made it a weekly practice, and I've been doing that weekly practice now for over 6 years. At some point in that time, I stopped getting the train as much, and so I started setting a timer for 12 minutes, as I've just done. And in that, created essentially the 12-minute method, although it wasn't called that at the time. Then about 3 years in, I realized that I'd got better at thinking about the people, the audience who might like my work, and tricking myself into doing things that would help my work get further. And one of the key ways I do that is, am I making it harder for the people who love my work the most? And I realized I kind of was. So for example, when I wanted to start, hadn't started a mailing list because for a while, a mailing list is resistance. It is procrastination. And then after a while, not doing it is resistance and procrastination, or at least was for me. So at first it was like much better for me to be focusing on coaching. And then once the writing became clearly a part of me and my work, not that I would have necessarily said that at the time, I realized it was only getting in the way of, say, my brother-in-law who would like to read my articles but doesn't go on LinkedIn, so relies on seeing it on Twitter to find an article. Or I could have a mailing list where he gets to read it, other people might want to read it. And I did the same thing with the 12-minute blog. For the people that would want to go back and read my whole blog, it was really hard. So, because LinkedIn is a terrible platform for finding content. It's hard for me to find the content that I have written, let alone somebody else. So to go back and read all my blogs is actually really hard. It's easier now they're on the 12-minute method pages on robbieswale.com. I thought I could make it into a book. And I was inspired a bit by Seth Godin, who'd released a compilation of his blogs over the previous few years. And I thought it'd be funny because I could call the book, if I made a book of my whole blog, I could call it, I wrote this book in 12 minutes. And that appeals to my sense of humor. And it's kind of true. It's true enough to be a clickbaity title anyway. And so I sat down with my friend Steve, who has worked with me on a bunch of things, Coach's Journey, podcast copy, the third and fourth 12-minute method books, the Power to Choose, which I might get to. And sat down with him because I thought he can help me edit that I wrote this book in 12 minutes. And he asked a great question. He said, it's a great title because it says, essentially it says, I did this. I wrote a book in 12 minutes. So why haven't you done? What's your excuse for not having done the thing that you've been meaning to do? But he said, can the rest of the book do that for people? And we didn't know. I didn't know. But I sat down with my coach, Katie, and I thought about, with her help, the 4 key stages of making something, of going from having not done something that you want to do to having done it. And then I sat down with those 4 stages and printed off 140 odd articles, the first 3 years of them. And I was like, well, do they deal out into these stages? And the remarkable thing was they basically did. And that was kind of astounding at the time, but the way I think about it now is it shouldn't have been, because the 12-minute writing practice, start, set the timer, go, stop when the timer stops. There's not much space for tactically thinking about what you're going to write. So I was mostly writing about, what am I most interested in? What am I wrestling with? What am I thinking about? And what I was interested in wrestling with and thinking about for myself was all these changes happening in my life, all the things that I'm writing about in this speaking about on this podcast series, the writing practice, the business, the books, the podcasts, all of that had been happening. Actually, maybe not the podcast yet at this point. And I've been doing coaching with people, building a coaching business. And so those things, that's also what people are mostly wrestling with in coaching, because coaching is really just someone comes to coaching because they have a thing they want to do, a thing they want to change, a thing they want to be different, and they don't know how to do it yet. And so we're bridging that gap. So it was obvious retrospectively that would be what I was writing about for 3 years, but it was still amazing to me that it dealt out with give or take 10 or so pieces, which you can find if you buy one of the books. You get a link to an ebook called The Cutting Room, which has got those ones that didn't make it in. So you can, if you buy one of the books, if you buy all the books and then download The Cutting Room, you've got all of those 12-minute method articles from those first 3 years. So it's 2016 to 2019. But there weren't many of them, and there weren't many duplicates. And, if I say so myself, I'd been working at the same time on another book, which I keep referencing, The Power to Choose. So there's a preview of that on my website. I'll put a link to that. And it was kind of galling, because as I wrote this book in 12 minutes back, I was like, this is actually better than the book that I've been trying to write for the last 3 years, that I've been working on in a more traditional book writing sense. And, having that insight, coming back to it, was really important for helping me keep going with the book project. So then what happened was, Steve did an edit on that. I began to write an intro and some intros to the parts. And then I started to think about publishing. And I was pretty attached to the idea of self-publishing. I liked it. It felt like it fit with the idea. But I also had this sense, when I was being coached by Katie at this point, Katie Harvey, that, my own, she might have even said it to me, I feel like you would be saying to yourself, you should be trying to get this published. You should be at least trying. And I thought, oh, she's right, isn't she? That does sound like the kind of thing I would do. So in a way, what I did was I did some research. I fired off some. I remember talking to one of my groups of clients, and I did some group coaching about making a proposal, sending it off to a publisher. No, I think maybe that was The Power to Choose, actually. 12-minute method, I sat down and I really did some kind of 80-20 analysis on it. And I thought, well, what are the publishers that I would most love to have this published by? And at least I'll send it to them. And a couple of them came back and said no, and one asked for more. And I remember thinking, and this was late 2019, I remember thinking, I hadn't done this yet, I remember thinking with Katie really hard about, do I want to get it out for Christmas, which I'd been kind of attached to. I think it was on my Warren Buffett list of goals for the year to publish. I wrote this book in 12 minutes. Do I want to get it out for Christmas? Which is better? And I was like, well, good is out for Christmas, but better is get it published by this publisher. I'm not going to talk about who they are, because you can ask me offline, but I'm really grateful to them because of what will happen, but I don't want to get into too much detail on it. So I then basically waited on this publisher. I waited while they read. I wrote this book in 12 minutes, and then I waited while they read The Power to Choose, because I thought, look, the truth is that knowing that I've got these 2 books ready to go might make it even more likely, and they might get more keen, and they kind of wanted to read both. And in the end, about a year later, it took about a year for me to, first of all, I wrote this book in 12 minutes, and then I sent them The Power to Choose. And then by started in the autumn maybe of 2019, by the summer of 2020, they said yes. They said, we'll publish both of these. And I remember walking around Battersea Park feeling like changed by that. Someone chose me, and my story about who I was changed. And then my mum is interesting. She was kind of questioning it a bit. And at first I thought she was just being, doing a mum thing, of kind of, as often our parents do, of like protecting us from things or wanting more from us. And I think actually she had an intuition about it, which was there was something, it wasn't quite right. And it was annoying because I would have liked her to have done that about a day later. So I could have had a bit more of like, yeah, I'm going to be a published author. This is amazing. But she was right about it. There was it wasn't, I discovered over the next couple of weeks that it wasn't quite right. The contract wasn't quite right for me, didn't feel right. The conversations with the publisher didn't quite feel right. I had a great conversation with my friend Joni Svart about the publishing industry, and decided to say no to that offer. And instead, I decided to do something different. And what I did amongst this time, one of the things I did was I signed up to Jericho Writers. I'm really excited that in October 2022, so just after, as this episode comes out, you'll still have just about have time to sign up for their Build a Book Month and hear me do a talk there. Very exciting for me, kind of, because I learned loads from Jericho Writers. Amazing community, cheap membership. You can learn everything you need to know about the very confused, complicated publishing industry. I had to undo quite a lot of my stories about publishing. I had to remember that it wasn't really my dream ever to be a Speechmarks published author. And I had to remember the kind of lessons of my dad, who's self-published a set of amazing poetry books. I'll put a link to his poetry books in the show notes too. And so in the end, I made some different choices. I wanted some help. I had been working with Robert Holden at the time. And he talks a lot about how the next level of success requires a new level of partnership. Like I knew the next part of my business needed more help. I wanted some experts. I liked the idea of having what I learned about from the publisher. I mean, I was so grateful for the faith that he put in me, but also I learned it would be so cool to have a team of experts in publishing working with me on this, because I'm not an expert in that. I wanted to find those people. I kind of found them in Tim and Joseph from what was selfpublished.co.uk. They've stopped doing it now. I had an amazing consultation with them where they started helping me with that stuff, where Tim coined the term 12-minute method. They suggested it was a series, which when I sat with it, I thought this is better as a series. And it's partly better from a publishing business point of view. That's why all your favorite authors write series. But it was also better because it means people could just get the start bit if that's what they need help with, or they could just get the share bit if that's what they need help with, or if they didn't have a creative project but they wanted to learn from me about doing great work, they could have how to create the conditions for great work. And those 4 books, of course, were the 4 stages, the 4 parts of the process that I came up with Katie in that coaching session. So there's quite a lot more that I could, in a way, tell about this story, and I've written some articles about that. You can find them on the 12-minute blog. You might have read some of them already. About different stages of the publishing journey, but in the end, the way I look back on it is it did take 2 years from 2019, when me and Steve were having that conversation and Katie and I talked about the stages and I dealt out the blogs, to publishing the first book, over 2 years. And I wonder a lot whether that was procrastination, because I ended up back with essentially, back with the same publishing method, self-publishing, for these books that I maybe knew all along. But it did help me in some ways. I learned a lot about publishing. I made better decisions about publishing these books. They're better books now because of what I learned about the publishing industry, because of the work I did with Tim and Joseph, because of the extra help I got from Steve, because of all these things. Publishing them in a series was also more of a 12-minute method thing to do, because it meant I could do one, learn from it, do another, learn from it, do another, learn from it. And I did, I think, get a bit trapped by excellence in those 2 years. And it does feel like this is a much better way for them to end up than how they would have ended up if we just published. I wrote this book in 12 minutes in late 2019. We can never know for sure, of course, but that's my intuition now. Like, I feel content with how these books came out. I love the cover. all these kind of things. And I'm really grateful to the help I've had from Tim and Joseph before we stopped working together, because they've changed their business focus, and to everybody else, Jericho Writers and everybody else along the way. So check out all of those people. I'm over time, so that's enough from me for today. But I'll be back next time, possibly with a meditation and or gratitude episode, possibly talking about this podcast. We'll see. All right. Have a wonderful rest of the day, everybody. Okay, just a couple more things before you head out to whatever else you've got going on in the rest of your day. If you want to find out a bit more about me or sign up to my mailing list, you can do that at www.robbieswale.com. If you want to read the 12-Minute Method books, you can find out more about them on my website. You can find them on Amazon, and you can find them in lots of other bookshops and booksellers around the world. You might want to come and join the 12-Minute Method Facebook group. You can find that by searching for the 12-Minute Method on Facebook, or there's links on my website. And you can find some other people there who are interested in doing work that matters to them and finally doing the things that they want to do. You can find me on lots of social media platforms. I'm most active on LinkedIn, so you might want to find me there. And most of all, I'd love to hear from you, especially if something that I've made has inspired you to finally do something you've been meaning to do for a long time. Hearing those stories are some of the most meaningful things for me in my work. And so they help me keep going when I might want to give up. So I'd love to hear from you. But most of all, I'd love it if you did that thing that matters to you, that you've been meaning to do.